So it was back in May when a Powerball ticket worth $429 million was sold in New Jersey. Only one ticket matched all 6 numbers. The numbers were 5, 25, 26, 44, and 66. And then the Powerball number was 9. It was the largest prize since a record $1.6 billion lottery in January. That one caused people to wait in lines for hours to get tickets. But that jackpot was split between 3 winning tickets. The one in May, one person. That person decided to take the one-time cash payout and would receive just over $284 million. Not sure what he would do with all that money. The odds of winning were 1 in 292.2 million. But that didn't stop people. Because everyone seemed to think, well, somebody's got to win it, right? Might as well be me. So what's $1 or $2 or 20 or 100? Why not? And a Gallup poll shows that in the last year, 6 out of every 10 people, 60% of you, have bought a lottery ticket in the last year. I'm not going to ask for a survey today. Yet something about saying the word gambling and Christian together just doesn't flow right. Something seems a little off. But is that because it's traditionally frowned upon in a legalistic way? Or is it because it really is wrong? So we've been in this series called, Is It Okay for a Christian to... Those questions that Christ followers wonder about, have questions about. And again, we look at it not based on what's culturally accepted, but about what the Bible says. And there are a lot of issues that Christians just aren't sure about. So far, we've looked at the topics such as, is it okay for a Christian to drink wine, to smoke marijuana, to watch R-rated movies? The first week, when we talked about R-rated movies, I didn't really get any pushback. I guess it's become commonplace for that. Last week, maybe a little bit different. And when I decided to do a series like this, trust me, I knew it was coming. I knew the criticism was coming. It actually hasn't been as bad as I thought it would be in all reality. But what I heard at lunch last week and what I've heard over the week, people have been talking about it. They've been studying it. They've gone back and read their Bibles. They've been thinking about it. And you know what? My job's done. Got you thinking. Because if you just come here and listen to what I say and don't think about it or don't question it in your mind, then I'm not doing my job. But when you think about it and you talk about it, I'm doing something right. So every week we've looked at the process, this matrix. And when we look at this diagram, I want to, again, walk through it fairly quickly. We always start with the Bible, because that's what a Christ follower should always start with. If there is a clear permission, that means yes, you can do it. If there's a clear prohibition, then no, you cannot. But what we've seen in most of these topics is that it falls into principles. There's not a clear prohibition, there's not a clear permission. So that takes us down into the freedom box. We have the freedom to do it, but the freedom based upon the principles that we glean from the Bible. But it doesn't end there. Because even when we have the freedom to do it, it may not be wise to do it. So then you look at the wisdom box, and you take your personal circumstances, you take your DNA, your background, your upbringing, and what might be okay for somebody to do, for me, it might be foolish to do, based on my upbringing and my background. So you have to take that into consideration. But then you also realize that there is a fourth box over there. And that is twofold, the witness and the weakness. When we look at witness, what we're talking about is, if I were to exercise this freedom publicly in front of non-Christians, would they say, clearly he doesn't follow Jesus? It's not about what we think in the church. It's my witness to the outside world. And we talked about that is, in all reality, fairly rare. There are very few things I can do that when people see me do it, if they're not a Christian, they're not going to say, you must follow somebody other than Jesus. But what we looked at last week was the weakness category. And in the weakness camp, what that means is that if I were to exercise the freedom that I have, are there situations where it would be hurtful to a fellow believer in terms of their attempt to follow Christ? So based upon their DNA, their upbringing, their background, is there something that they would fall into a weakness category? And if that's the case, then I shouldn't do it around them. It has nothing to do with whether I can do it on my own. It has to do with someone else's weakness. So that's the diagram we've been working with. What's not part of that diagram? What's not part of that diagram, and it's because of what the question is. The question is it okay for a Christian to do? The question is not, is it okay for a Seventh-day Adventist to do? So there is not a box, the Seventh-day Adventist Church says. There's not a box for Ellen White. And that's intentional. Because the question is it okay for a Christian to do something? Because you get to heaven because you're a Christ follower. You don't get to heaven because you're Seventh-day Adventist. You don't get to heaven because you don't smoke, you don't drink alcohol, you don't watch R-rated movies. There's a difference there. So, with that background in mind, this week, we're going to say, is it okay for a Christian to gamble? From slot machines to blackjack. From playing poker to buying a lottery ticket. From FanDuel to DraftKings, fantasy football. Beginning with what the Bible says about gambling. What's the Bible say about gambling? Surprisingly, nothing. It does talk about the Roman soldiers gambling for Jesus' clothes at the foot of the cross. But it doesn't do so as part of a moral judgment. It's just an observation of what they were doing. So there's no direct prohibition. There's no direct permission. So that kicks us down into the freedom box, which means we have to see what principles are there. And there are two major principles in the Bible when it comes to gambling. The first one is don't gamble for money in place of working for money. It should never be a lazy person's substitute for hard work that's involved in a job. The value of working for money is celebrated throughout the Bible. And let me give you a sample. I'm going to go through these verses fairly quick, and I'm not going to really comment on them because they're pretty self-explanatory. Most of them, or all of them, will be in the book of Proverbs. So how long are you going to laze around doing nothing? How long before you get out of bed? A nap here, a nap there. A day off here, a day off there. Sit back. Take it easy. Do you know what comes next? Just this. You can look forward to a dirt poor life. Poverty, your permanent house guest. Lazy people are soon poor. Hard workers get rich. Work hard and become a leader. Be lazy and become a slave. Hard work always pays off. Mere talk puts no bread on the table. A farmer too lazy to plant in the spring has nothing to harvest in the fall. Don't be too fond of sleep. You'll end up in the poorhouse. Wake up and get up. Then there will be food on the table. You get the idea? Nobody thinks that laziness is a virtue. And there are subtle ways of being lazy. Trying to gamble your way to money. Or really any get-rich-quick scheme is just that. It's trying to bypass working. And that is a subtle way of laziness. And that's why the Bible is not a fan of gambling for that end to get rich, as an alternative to working hard. So when you bypass the hard work in search of winning a winning lottery ticket or the big bet payoff for that poker tournament, it's really just a form of laziness. And not just laziness, but also foolishness. Again, look at what Proverbs has to say about this. A hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies has no sense. And then similarly, a hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies ends up in poverty. So that's the first principle that we see in the Bible as far as gambling is concerned. Don't gamble, don't chase a fantasy in place of work, in search of an income. The second principle that we're going to look at. When gaming of any kind, whether it involves gambling or not, becomes an addiction, a compulsion, or a budget buster, it's gone too far. And at that point, it needs to be reined back in. Because the Bible calls us to be good stewards of our money, of our time. So the first principle is don't gamble for money in place of working for money. Then the second principle is don't gamble at the expense of stewardship. Now, spending money on gaming of some sort, or quite frankly, anything else for that matter, that irresponsibly blows your budget. It could be eating out, it could be buying expensive clothing, buying that third or even fourth car. Spending money on anything that eats away at good stewardship is simply not good. So if you blew past any reasonable recreational budget on fantasy football this year, in such a way that it caused you to not be able to give to God, not to be able to save for the future, or even to pay a monthly bill, then gambling became wrong. So there are these two principles when we look at the matrix that we see. Is there a permission? No. Is there a prohibition? No. When we look at the principles, we have these two principles that we just talked about. Don't gamble for money in place of working for money. And don't gamble at the expense of biblical stewardship. But are we done? No. We have to look at the wisdom box. If you have a compulsive or an addictive nature, then gambling is probably a freedom you should not partake in. It would not be wise for you. But we're not done there. We have another box to go. Well, there's nothing about buying a lottery ticket or sitting down in front of a blackjack table that would say to the outside non-Christian world that I am not a Christ follower. So witness doesn't come into play here, but weakness very well may. And again, we looked at Paul's words last week when we talked about weakness. When Paul said, live in such a way that you will not cause another believer to stumble and fall. Don't tear apart the work of God over what you eat. Remember, all foods are acceptable. But it is wrong to eat something if it makes another person stumble. It is better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else if it might cause another believer to stumble. Again, Paul here isn't talking about people inside the church, the Christians who just want you to do it because of their legalistic view of it, because they view it as wrong. He says Christians shouldn't do that. But what he does say is those who are spiritually vulnerable in this area, you need to be sensitive to their vulnerabilities. And with gambling, if someone has been addicted to gambling and they've lost their job and they've lost their home and their retirement and all of that stuff before they came to Christ, it is probably not a good idea to invite them to a weekend in Vegas. That is not wise for them. It may be perfectly fine for you to go to Vegas on your own because that's a freedom that we have. But to take somebody with that background would be putting them in a position of falling. But again, those situations are pretty rare. And it really has nothing to do with going to Vegas. It has to do with being common sense with other people that you're in contact with. So the question is, does that mean I can gamble? I mean, if I follow these principles, if I work honestly, steward my money well, and there's not a personal wisdom or a community weakness issue at hand, does that mean I can spend my money on gaming recreationally without guilt? Just like I would spend it recreationally on eating out, buying a movie ticket, going to a show. Anything else you can think of? Does that mean you can do it the same way? Biblically, my answer is yes. Biblically, yes, but I know what you're thinking. It still feels weird and sounds weird to say that it's okay for a Christian to gamble. And I get that because Amy and I have been on several Christian music cruises. Now, if you've ever been on a cruise ship, one of the central areas of the cruise ship is the casino. And when you're on a Christian cruise, you walk through there and nobody's playing anything. Every once in a while, if you go really late at night, there might be somebody over there playing slots. But generally what happens, you have all these blackjack dealers and all these other people that are kind of sitting there like, what in the world is going on this boat? Usually it's a hop-in place and there's nobody in this joint. But everyone's walking through and you can tell as people are walking through, they're looking to see if anyone's out there playing. Why does it feel so weird to us? Let me take it a little bit step further. No matter where you might have stood on gambling before you walked into this church today, can I posit that you already are gambling? If I were to offer you a ticket for $1 for the chance of winning a car in order to support a local school, did I just invite you into a raffle or a lottery? But you know, saying it's a raffle is just so much more Jesus-y. But it's a lottery. So let me give you another example. You sit down in front of a machine, you put your money into the game, and you either win or you lose at this game. If you lose, well, you got to play, which is what most people are there for. You lose the money you put in. But you still got the bells and the whistles, the sound effects. But if you win, you get the money or the equivalent of money that you can then cash in. Did I just describe a slot machine in Vegas or a gaming machine at Dave & Buster's or Chuck E. Cheese? They're the same. So why are we so hung up on gambling as Christians? I'm going to posit that there are two main reasons we are. And one of them is perfectly fine. One of them I'm going to suggest we need to try and get out of the church. The reason that is good is that we have seen Christians that have been in a really, really, really bad spot because of gambling. They've lost things. But they've never really had someone teach them about exercising freedom in light of biblical principle. They've just seen it as a do or a don't. There's no principles involved. And I can understand that way of thinking. If you were raised that way with either a do or a don't, there's no gray in between, that you would have a knee-jerk reaction to the topic of gambling. Fair enough. I understand that. If you've seen people who've experienced this freedom without principles, and you know the pain that they can go through. But there's another reason. And this is the reason I think we need to get out of the church. And we flirted with it a couple times in this series. But I'm going to take a little bit of time to actually dive into it. And that is legalism. The idea of legalism is to protect the principles. To protect the bad from happening. And in order to do that, the only way to do it, according to a legalist, is that you have to take away the freedoms. Which then reduces spirituality to outward practices. And this is what set up the tension between Jesus, teachers of the law, and Pharisees. You see, there wasn't really anyone more religious than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They studied the Old Testament backwards and forwards. But what they did, they took that Old Testament, they took the Ten Commandments and other writings in the Old Testament, and they then decided that in all reality, what there really are, there are 248 commandments and 365 prohibitions. They pulled them out of the Old Testament. And then they lifted those things out and vowed to obey every single one of those in addition to the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments. And just to make sure they didn't break one of the rules, they then made more rules about the rules that they took out of the Old Testament. And more laws about the laws that they saw in the Old Testament. In fact, they came up with an additional 1,500 additions. And all of this oral tradition was later gathered into what is now known as the Mishnah. But even that wasn't enough. Let me demonstrate this graphically. So you have the Old Testament. They said there are 248 commandments, 365 prohibitions. So they added a layer to the Old Testament. And then they said there's another 1,500. Which is the Mishnah. But even that wasn't enough for them. So they then created more rules and more laws. And that is what became known as the Gemara. And together, the Mishnah and the Gemara is what's known as the Talmud. So how did these rules about rules play out? Kind of crazy when you think about it. To avoid using the Lord's name in vain, which we know is one of the Ten Commandments. A good idea to not take the Lord's name in vain. But in order to avoid that, they refused to even say God's name. Because they were worried, even if it was in honor and respect or worship or prayer, they were worried about, well, what if that was actually in vain? So they refused to even say his name. To avoid committing adultery, the men would lower their heads whenever they saw a female and would walk past the woman and wouldn't even look at the woman. Because if they looked at her, they might lust after her. So they wouldn't even look at a woman. And when they read about the fact that you should rest and not work on the Sabbath, they had to figure out, what constitutes work. So they figured out that you could not take more than 50 steps on a Sabbath. Because if you took more than 50, then that was considered work. I think I've done more than 50 back and forth, so I'm in trouble. They also decided that on the Sabbath, a person could eat, but they couldn't cook. They could bandage a wounded person, but they could not apply medicine. And if you were a woman, you weren't allowed to look in the mirror. Because if you looked in the mirror, you might see a gray hair. And if you saw gray hair, you might be tempted to pluck it out. And if you plucked out a gray hair, well, that is working on the Sabbath. The original Greek word for all of this is analyst, from which we get the word anal. I should make that up. But you get the point. You take what is seemingly good, the Ten Commandments, the Old Testament, and you start extracting. You get circles and circles and circles. And now you can't do hardly anything without violating the law. You see how crazy that is? What did Jesus have to say about this? In fact, he was pretty direct when he talked about it. And we see that in Luke. And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry. When we take a look at that, woe, we've talked about that word before. Jesus gave the ultimate prophetic condemnation. That's what woe was. And why did he do it? What did he say was the cause of that woe? Because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry. Another place, he said it this way. Instead of giving you God's law as food and drink by which you can banquet on God, they package it in bundles of rules, loading you down like pack animals. They seem to take pleasure in watching you stagger under these loads. Can I say Jesus hated legalism? He knew that it killed people's hearts, that it killed their spirits. Not only does it cripple a person's spiritual life, but it makes a mockery out of it. Because if it's all about legalism, then you can play the law like a tax lawyer does. Luckily, I don't do tax law. Because what's a tax lawyer do? They find loopholes, technicalities. They may follow the letter of the law, but they certainly don't follow the spirit of the law. So what was Jesus after? If he wasn't after legalism, what was he after? What did he want to take the place of legalism? Let's read what he says. Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Let that soak in for a minute. Jesus said, if you don't do better than the legalists, if you don't do better than the law keepers, the rule followers, the sin patrol, you can't even catch a glimpse of heaven. And he wasn't saying that we should add another layer around it. He wasn't saying go a bit further than what they are. He's talking about to be different spiritually altogether. Because all that God was to them, the legalists, was a set of do's and don'ts. Something that determined what you did, but not who you were. And you know, we're all vulnerable to this. It's easy to fall into a legalistic set of rules and regulations, to try and capture spirituality, and to gain acceptance with God through those rules and regulations. Because our tendency is to think like a Pharisee. I like what John Ortberg said in one of his books. He said, if you were driving through San Francisco during the 60s, and you pulled up to a stoplight next to a van plastered with peace signs, driven by a long-haired, tie-dye, granny glasses-wearing person, you would have known that you had encountered a hippie. If you went back in the 80s and came across a BMW, driven by someone wearing Gucci shoes, wearing a Rolex watch, having their hair noosed back and nibbling on a bit of brie, you would know that you had spotted a yuppie. Much like today, if you came across a tractor, driven by someone in boots and overalls, chewing tobacco and a spit stain coming down their beard, missing some teeth and scratching their flea bites, you'd know that you had spotted a Duke graduate. We can do the same things, can't we? We listen to our spiritual music. We talk in spiritual buzz talk Adventese. We follow extraneous moral codes, participate in certain activities while abstaining from certain others. And somehow we think we're being spiritual, or we're engaging in a personal relationship with God. But that's what we do. That is not who we are. Because spirituality is not about religion. It's about a relationship. Let me say that again. Spirituality is not about religion. It's about a relationship. What Jesus was after was for people to live out the purpose for which the law was given. Not in some external, superficial, legalistic way, but through a transformed heart. Jesus was saying that the spirituality of the Pharisees was not spirituality at all. It was dead, lifeless, and empty. It made life with God all about doing rather than being. Because you can set up your lists and your policies and your procedures, your rules and your regulations, and you can follow them to the T. But still not have intimacy. Still not have any life change. No transformation. No connection with God at all. Are we doing that? As a church? As a denomination? I said every week I may get myself in trouble, and I think I'm about to go down that road. You see, in preparing for this, I was looking at the baptismal certificates. And the baptismal certificates say that you will not do a whole lot of things. Are those things in and of themselves sin? Or are they rules that we add around the relationship with Jesus? You see, when I start this series, I didn't start with what the answer was supposed to be. That's not the way you do research. I started with a question. Then I went through the process, and whatever the answer was, the answer it was. I can start with, I want the answer to be, well, no, you can't gamble. And then find things throughout the Bible to support that. But this isn't Jeopardy. We need to do the research and figure out what the answer is based upon the question. Last night at Hope Trending, I heard one of the panelists talk about this, and it made me think about this. He talked about that baptism is really a twofold baptism. Baptism by water and baptism by fire, meaning the Holy Spirit. You see, we tend to think they have to be one and the same baptism. I'm not sure they have to. You see, somebody comes forward and says, I want to be baptized, and they're on fire for Christ at that moment. And then we tell them, okay, well, here's this 13-week study you need to go through. Come back in 13 weeks. Some of them never make it back to that point where they were on fire. Some of them, even if they are baptized, recent studies show that 49% of people who are baptized in the Seventh-day Adventist Church leave the church. When someone is on fire for God, you need to accept them then. Not tell them in 13 weeks, once you stop drinking and stop smoking and stop doing all these other things, you can then become a member of our church. Matthew 28. Go make disciples. What's a disciple? That is a Christ follower. That's our call, to go make disciples. Then it says, baptize them. Teach them. The teaching is after the baptism. So, baptism by water, maybe when that person is first on fire, they say, I want to be a Christ follower. They may know nothing about the Adventist church. This isn't official Adventist doctrine. I say you baptize. You then help them to find out what this church is all about. And as they learn that baptism by fire, baptism by the Holy Spirit will come. We seem to think they got to be at the same time. We won't let them have baptism by water until they're ready to have baptism by the Holy Spirit. I think that's wrong. Authentic spirituality is not about do's and don'ts. If you're hung up on whether someone else can have a glass of wine, or gamble, or watch The Walking Dead, or go to Vegas, or you make not doing those things what it means to follow Christ, then you've missed what life with Christ is all about. Don't give in to the lie and lure of legalism. Because if you do, you're going to miss out on what grace alone can offer. A personal, vibrant, freeing, life-changing relationship with the living God as a forgiver, as a leader, and someone that can transform your life. And if you've missed out on that, you've missed everything.